But with police now investigating mental health as a possible motive for this week's deadly van attack in Toronto, there's a growing conversation about whether this can stigmatize mental health issues unfairly or whether it offers important insights into mass violence and maybe how to prevent it. Joining us this morning is Jennifer Chambers. She's the Executive Director of the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health's Empowerment Council. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Often when we look at an attack like this, it seems so senseless and people talk about different motives and we often land on mental illness because I think sometimes people don't know what else to think other than why would anybody in a sound state of mind commit such an act. But what does this say about how we view mental illness in our society?
Well, I think in a way, the idea of sort of ill or well or normality has replaced the whole concepts of good and evil. So in a way, people are trying to be better and progressive by saying someone who did something like that must be sick. But then unfortunately, the reasoning tends to go around with people see someone who's behaving unusually and they assume that they're dangerous. I think when these things happen, a lot of marginalized groups sort of hunker down thinking, don't let this be a member of my group.
Sure.
Because we really fear the kind of generalized fear or hatred that can result targeting people who have nothing to do with this. Clearly, people who have mental health issues are a large segment of the population and are not out committing mass murder.
It's an interesting place to land because, for example, if we were to say it's terror, people feel like they know how to respond to that. They know the appropriate response is to be afraid, to be on guard. But when it is tagged with mental illness, how does society generally react as a whole? Do we sort of ignore it then and say, well, it was a one-off?
I think that the worst thing that people can do is to sort of go to hatred and trying to suppress the rights and to control a large segment of the population who had nothing to do with what happened. I think that the only way to process it is to try and understand the individual and what happened to him and see if we can learn anything from that. We don't know enough yet to do that.
That's true. All right, a study from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health found that these are some interesting numbers. The rate of homicides where the offender was found not criminally responsible because of mental illness has more or less stayed steady since 1987. We were surprised to find this. The National Trajectory Project found that only 9% of crimes committed by those with mental illness were violent. So it seems the rate at which we hear about violent crimes being carried out by people with mental illness is actually higher than what we see in these numbers. Why is that?
I think it's because when people aren't doing something for sort of maybe selfish criminal reasons, it's often, and people have mental health issues, it's often kind of an unusual crime. It stands out in that way in the media, so it gets a great deal of attention. And I think that an additional prejudice that sometimes happens is Canadians assume that the system of finding people not criminally responsible is similar to what they see on American television of temporary insanity, that it's a walk. People are going to get off if they do that. Whereas in reality, they're more likely to be detained for longer than they are if they're sent to jail or prison. There are exceptions to that because sometimes people get over the mental state they're in much more quickly. But for the most part, people are detained for quite a long period of time and then they're supervised on release.
I think that's a really important point to make because you're right. I think the assumption is if we tag it with mental illness and found not criminally responsible, I think it's the language that makes people a little uncertain, that the assumption is then it's a lighter sentence.
The other thing to understand about that is not criminally responsible means that the person's state of mind in some way makes the crime not a crime in the sense that they didn't intend to do something like that. Maybe they thought they were defending themselves. But just because someone has mental health issues and then commits a criminal act, or it would be a criminal act if they intended it, doesn't mean they're going to get off. Like if someone has mental health issues but they do something out of hate, that is not going to mean that they're found NCR. It actually has to explain the purpose of the crime.
Good to have you here on this. Answered a lot of questions for us. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.